The day everything shattered began like any ordinary Alaskan morning. Cold, quiet, and wrapped in a kind of silence that usually comforts the soul. But that silence didn't comfort me anymore. Not after the life I had lived. Not after the disrespect I had swallowed piece by piece, year after year. I still remember the sting on my cheek that morning, the unexpected slap from my own son. A boy I once held against my chest during snowstorms, a boy I kept warm with my own body when we had no heater, a boy I fed before I ever fed myself. He looked me straight in the eyes, the same eyes that had once softened when I braided his hair as a child, and said, "This is my house now. Don't touch anything without asking." His voice didn't tremble. Mine did. He pushed past me in the hallway, the same hallway where he took his first steps, where he spilled juice, where he laughed endlessly as a child. "I swear, Mom, you're always in the way," he muttered. And just like that, the years of sacrifices I made for him became invisible, erased the way snow wipes away footprints after a storm. I stood there, stunned, my hand trembling as it touched the burning spot on my face, wondering how the boy I once carried on my back through frozen winds could become a man who treated me like a burden. The house felt different now, even though nothing had changed. The same furniture, the same walls, the same photographs, but everything looked colder, harsher, unfamiliar. I felt like a stranger in the home I had built with my hands, my sweat, and my sleepless nights. Life in Alaska is not soft. It shapes you with storms, with darkness, with months of icy loneliness. But nothing in all my winters had prepared me for the frost growing inside my own home. I spent that entire morning replaying the moment, trying to tell myself it was anger, stress, maybe frustration. But deep down I knew it wasn't a mistake. It was a mirror reflecting the truth I had avoided for years. My son no longer saw me as his mother. He saw me as a temporary visitor. Someone taking up space, someone whose presence annoyed him. And that realization pierced deeper than any slap ever could. I walked into the kitchen, where years ago I used to make his favorite hot soup after school, and I stared at the empty countertop. There was a time when he would lean his head on my shoulder, telling me stories about his day. But now, all I heard were the echoes of cold words he had thrown at me recently. "Don't touch my things. Don't rearrange anything. Don't embarrass me in front of my friends. You're too slow, too old, too sensitive." Every sentence weighed heavier than Alaskan snowstorms. I poured myself a cup of tea, but my hands shook too much to hold the mug straight. My entire body felt like it was shrinking, like the walls were pushing in, like I was disappearing in my own home. And as I stood there in that quiet kitchen, surrounded by memories that suddenly felt like strangers, I realized something heartbreaking. Storms outside never scared me, but the storm growing inside my own family finally did. For the rest of that week, I moved around the house like a quiet shadow, careful not to upset him, careful not to make a sound that might bring another storm of anger. It was strange, how a home filled with my sacrifices could suddenly feel like a rented room. Every floorboard I stepped on seemed to complain under my weight, as if warning me that this place no longer belonged to me. My son barely spoke unless it was to criticize me. Once I accidentally dropped a glass while washing the dishes, and he shouted so loudly that the neighbor's dogs barked. "You're getting clumsy," he said with disgust. "I can't babysit you all my life." Babysit me. Those words carved deep scars inside my chest. This was the same boy I taught to walk when his legs were too weak, the same boy whose nightmares I soothed, whose fevers I cooled using cold towels through sleepless nights. I remembered the winter when he was 6 and was too sick to breathe properly. I held him upright against my chest for the entire night so he wouldn't choke. I didn't close my eyes even once. I would have given my life for him. But now he couldn't even give me a kind tone. Each time he saw me sitting in the living room, he would sigh loudly, shaking his head as if my presence was an inconvenience. "You don't do anything," he would mutter. "You just sit around like you're fragile." He didn't know how fragile I truly had become. Not physically, but emotionally. Alaska is a land where the cold tests every fiber of your strength. Yet nothing tested me more than sitting alone at the dinner table while he ate in his room, slamming the door behind him. I'd cook meals for him, the same recipes he loved as a boy, but he barely thanked me. Once he even said, Don't think cooking makes you useful. Those words crushed something inside me that I didn't know was still alive. I looked at my hands that worked, cooked, washed, sewed, cleaned, held him, protected him, and suddenly they looked empty. Useless. Invisible. Nights were the hardest. I could hear him laughing with his friends on the phone, making plans, living a life where I didn't exist. The moonlight coming through the window reminded me of the older days, when we used to sit together, reading stories, sharing dreams. Now even the walls seemed to echo loneliness back at me. Every corner of the house felt colder. Sometimes, late at night, I would tiptoe into the living room just to look at the family photos hanging crooked on the wall. Most were pictures of him, birthdays, school plays, graduations. I stood there whispering to myself, where did I go wrong? When did love turn into resentment? No answers came. Only silence. A silence that sat on my shoulders like a mountain. The worst moment came one evening when I softly asked him, "Would you like some tea?" And without even glancing at me, he said, "Don't try to act sweet now. You're too much sometimes." Too much. I swallowed the words along with my pride, nodding quietly even though tears burned behind my eyes. It was in that moment, standing under the dim kitchen light, holding a cup no one wanted, that I realized something painful. I was no longer a mother in his story. I was just an old chapter he wanted to tear out. And yet, despite the coldness, despite the disrespect, a small part of me kept hoping that the son I once knew, the boy who hugged me tightly during storms, still lived somewhere behind that hardened man. But hope can be a dangerous thing. And in Alaska, hope freezes fast if you don't hold it close. Days kept passing, and with each passing sunrise, I felt myself shrinking deeper into the corners of the house I once ruled with warmth. My son had stopped looking at me entirely. He only looked through me, as if I were transparent, a ghost wandering the hallways. Sometimes he would talk loudly on the phone about how tiring it was to have an old person at home, and every word pierced me harder than the icy winds outside. It was strange how disrespect could slowly become a routine, how cruelty could become a daily background sound, like the humming of the old refrigerator. One evening, as the snow piled high outside and the wind screamed across the frozen windows, he came home irritated, slamming doors the way he used to as a teenager. He stormed into the kitchen where I was quietly peeling potatoes and barked, "Did you touch my jackets?" I froze. My hand stopped moving, the potato slipping from my fingers. I tried to explain gently that I had only hung them to dry because they were wet from the snow, but he cut me off with a raised hand and said, "Don't do things without permission. You make everything worse." Worse. That word echoed in my chest like a sharp blade. I opened my mouth to defend myself, but the words died before reaching my lips. The silence between us wasn't peaceful. It was suffocating. Later, when he walked out again to meet friends, I stood in the dim kitchen light staring at the half-peeled vegetables, my breath trembling. There had been a time when he would run to me with muddy boots and messy hair, shouting, "Mama, look! I built a snow fort." Now he couldn't stand the sight of me touching a wet jacket. After dinner, which he didn't bother eating, I walked into the living room, sat on the old rocking chair, and listened to the sound of the wind pounding against the house. It reminded me of how loud life used to be, laughter, stories, dreams, and how quiet it had become now. The TV remote lay on the table untouched, but I couldn't bring myself to watch anything. Instead, I found myself tracing the wooden arm of the rocking chair with my finger, following its grooves like the timeline of my life. When he returned later that night, I pretended to be asleep, even though I lay wide awake. He didn't check on me. He didn't even lower his voice. He just walked past my door, speaking to someone on the phone, complaining about how she can't do anything right. My chest tightened until it hurt. It's a strange kind of pain. The kind that comes when the person you love most starts using your heart as a punching bag without even realizing it. Yet even after all the harsh words and cold looks, a small piece of me still wanted to understand him, to believe that beneath the hardened tone and careless behavior, the sweet boy I raised was still alive somewhere. But that night, as he laughed loudly down the hallway, I realized something I had avoided for too long. Sometimes love blinds you to the truth. And the truth was that my son wasn't just having a bad week. He was becoming someone I no longer recognized. I felt like a child being scolded for something she didn't do. He stormed out a second later, slamming the door so hard the windows rattled, leaving me standing alone in that storm of silence. Tears finally fell, warm against the coldness of that room. Tears I had held back for months. I knelt down to pick up the scattered items from the floor. The sewing needles, the buttons, the half-finished sweater, the memories of a time when he used to sit beside me asking, "Mama, tell me a story before bed." As I placed the table back upright, my hands shaking uncontrollably, a painful realization settled over me like Alaska's darkest winter. I no longer felt safe in my own home. I no longer felt respected. I no longer felt seen. That night I couldn't sleep. I sat near the small window watching the snowfall cover the world in white, wishing it could cover the pain inside me too. I remembered the days when he would hold my hand crossing the icy roads, telling me he would protect me when he grew up. Now, he couldn't even protect his own humanity. My chest ached with memories, with love, with disappointment, with grief. Grief for a son who was still alive but lost to anger and pride. As the hours passed, I knew something had to change. The home I built, the love I gave, the sacrifices I made, none of it mattered to him anymore. And no matter how much I denied it, no matter how much a mother's heart wanted to forgive everything, a truth finally whispered through the quiet. I could no longer stay here if staying meant losing myself completely. The storm outside was nothing compared to the storm inside, but that night, for the first time in years, I began to think about leaving. Not because I stopped loving him, but because I finally remembered I deserved to be loved too. The next morning, when the first pale rays of sunlight touched the frozen Alaskan snow, I finally felt something inside me shift. Not courage, not anger, but clarity. I had spent years believing that love meant staying, enduring, sacrificing, forgiving endlessly. But now I understood that sometimes love means knowing when to walk away before you completely lose your soul. I quietly packed a small bag, not with much, just a few clothes, my old winter coat, and the photograph of him as a baby, the one where he was smiling with his tiny hands gripping my fingers as if I were his whole world. I slipped the photo between the pages of my diary, the same diary that held years of silent pain I had never spoken aloud. As I zipped the bag, I heard him moving around in the kitchen, talking loudly on the phone, laughing at something someone said. Not once did he ask where I was or why I hadn't prepared breakfast. Not once did he come to my room to check if I was all right after the previous night's outburst. His world no longer included me, and that truth felt heavier than the winter snow. I walked out into the living room and stopped for one last look. The couch where he used to curl up beside me during movie nights, the wall where we hung his school drawings, the old wooden clock he gifted me when he got his first job. Memories layered over memories, but none of them could save what we had become. When he finally noticed my bag in my hand, he didn't ask the obvious question. He just frowned and said, "Where are you going?" His tone wasn't worried. It was annoyed, as if my leaving was an inconvenience to his routine. I took a slow breath, my heart breaking and healing at the same time. "I'm giving you space," I said softly. "And I'm giving myself peace." He rolled his eyes. "You're being dramatic," he muttered, turning away. That one careless sentence sealed everything. If he couldn't feel even a flicker of regret, even a drop of remorse, then there was nothing left for me to fix. I opened the door slowly, letting the sharp cold air brush against my face like a final blessing. My hands trembled not from fear but from freedom. With each step outside I felt the weight lifting, the chains loosening, the suffocation easing. The snow crunched beneath my boots as if welcoming me back into a world where silence didn't hurt and coldness didn't wound. I didn't know where I was going yet. Maybe to a shelter, maybe to an old friend, maybe to a quiet town a few miles away. But for the first time in a long time, the path ahead felt like mine. As I walked down that long icy road, the house behind me grew smaller and smaller, until it was no longer a home but just a building full of echoes. I wiped my tears with the back of my hand and whispered to myself, "You survived worse storms than this." And I had. I had survived heartbreak, loneliness, frozen nights, and years of silent suffering. This was just another winter, and winters always end. With the sky beginning to turn golden and the snow reflecting the light like diamonds scattered across the earth, I took my first real breath in years. A breath of freedom. A breath of self-worth. A breath that felt like the first page of a new life I no longer feared to live. The farther I walked from the house, the lighter my chest began to feel, as if each breath pushed away years of hurt I had buried under silence. The Alaskan sky slowly shifted from pale gray to soft gold. And for the first time in so long, I noticed its beauty. My fingers were numb from the cold, but my heart felt strangely warm. Warm with a freedom I had forgotten belonged to me. I walked for miles until my legs ached, and when I finally reached the small bus stop near the frozen lake, I sat down and let the quietness seep into my bones. This silence didn't suffocate me. It healed me. As the wind brushed against my face, I thought about all the winters I had survived. The ones outside and the ones inside my home. Love can make you endure storms no one else can see, but it can also blind you to the wounds you carry. I realized I had spent years trying to be everything for someone who no longer wanted anything from me. That realization didn't break me. It freed me. When the bus pulled up, its warm lights glowing in the snowy morning, I stepped inside and chose a seat next to the window. As the engine rumbled and the road began to disappear behind us, I took out the photograph of him as a baby. His tiny fingers curled around my thumb, his smile full of innocence and trust. Tears welled in my eyes, not of pain but of acceptance. I did my part, I whispered to the photo. And somewhere inside I hope the boy you used to be remembers me. Maybe he would call one day. Maybe he wouldn't. But I finally understood that my life couldn't keep waiting for an apology that might never come. The bus carried me past snow-covered forests, frozen rivers, and small towns tucked between mountains. Every mile felt like a chapter closing. Every turn felt like a page turning. For the first time in years, I let myself dream again. A small cabin near the woods, a peaceful job, maybe a community that didn't treat me like an inconvenience. Maybe even friends. A place where respect wasn't a luxury. A place where I could breathe without tiptoeing. A life where I mattered. As the bus climbed a hill, I looked out at the vast white landscape stretching endlessly before me. Alaska had taught me many things: strength, resilience, survival. But today it taught me something new. You can walk away from the darkest winter and still find a spring waiting for you. I leaned my head against the window, closed my eyes, and let the warmth of the heater melt the last pieces of fear inside me. I didn't know where the road ahead would lead, but it didn't scare me anymore. The worst part of my life was behind me, frozen in a house that no longer deserved me. With a slow, steady breath, I whispered to myself, "This is not the end. This is my beginning." And as the bus moved forward, carrying me toward a future I had long denied myself, I finally felt whole again. A woman who survived, who broke free, and who chose herself after a lifetime of choosing everyone else. After the bus carried her deeper into the quiet Alaskan wild, she didn't look back again. Not toward the house, not toward the broken pieces of what used to be her life. But what she didn't know was that this was not the end of her story, only the beginning of a reckoning that had been years in the making. While she found refuge in that cabin, far from the voices that had belittled her, the world she left behind was beginning to crack. The house she had walked away from, the one they proudly remodeled, posed in for photos and labeled their forever home, was not the fortress they believed it to be. It sat on foundations built not just with money, but with her name, her sacrifices, her legal presence woven into every signature and page. And consequences were already in motion. Exactly 31 days after she stopped the mortgage payments, a cold official envelope arrived on their doorstep, carrying words they never expected: default notice, outstanding obligations, foreclosure warning. Panic spread through their newly painted hallways like wildfire. They scrambled, cursed, blamed each other, and then blamed her. Her son, the same boy who once clung to her hand while crossing icy roads, called her with a trembling voice cracked by fear. "Mom, we're losing the house. Why did you do this?" he pleaded. But she didn't answer, not out of spite, not out of revenge, but because the truth had already spoken. His own words, once sharp enough to wound her soul, now echoed back to him through the legal system he thought she didn't understand. While he fell apart, she slowly rebuilt. In her cabin, she filled the silence not with regret but with purpose. She unpacked memories one by one: photos, letters, the soft worn blanket she crocheted during her husband's chemo, and placed them gently into her new world. She wrote for hours each day, her voice steady, reclaiming decades she had been erased from. And while she wrote, the next storm approached, not for her but for them. A legal clause buried deep in her husband's supplemental will was finally activated. The clause he wrote with trembling hands when he feared this very outcome. It stated, clearly and unshakably, that if their son ever abused or attempted to evict her, all inheritance would be transferred to her alone. And now, with the recording she kept, the slap, his voice commanding her to get out, the clause was ironclad. On the day of the family meeting, when they all gathered, smug and expectant, she entered the room not as the quiet, overlooked woman they remembered, but as someone they had underestimated for far too long. She laid the evidence before them, the will, the clause, the recording, and watched their confidence crumble piece by piece. The slap they thought was a moment of dominance became the very thing that disinherited them. Their power shattered. Their plans dissolved. And she simply breathed. She did not yell. She did not boast. She did not punish. She just watched justice unfold like a long-delayed sunrise. And then she walked away. Back to her cabin. Back to her lake. Back to her peace. People think silence is weakness. But her silence had become her strategy, her shield, her victory. She didn't keep the house. She kept her dignity. She kept her story. And when she finally sat on the porch of her new home, warm mug in hand, watching the mist rise off the water, she understood something her long, painful journey had been trying to teach her. She did not lose a family. She lost illusions. She did not lose a home. She lost a prison. And what she gained, what she built for herself, was something no one could ever take again. Not with words. Not with hands. Not with signatures. Peace was hers now. And peace, once earned through fire, becomes unbreakable.